Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Pioneering Pensions. For you who don't know me, my name is Stefan Lundberg, and I have a passion for pension. My excitement for pension is that it is more than just a product. It is a social security that help people have a greater life after work. And this is also quite intriguing because there's a lot of different dimensions in it, which we as experts can dig into. And during my years, I met a lot of interesting people who have done exciting stuff in pioneering the pension land, pushing the boundaries. And today we have the privilege to meet with Don Ezra. I know Don for several years, and we had a lot of discussions around DC. And I always get sort of insights from Don, looking at the world slightly differently than I used to. So therefore, I wanted to share all those insights with you. And what better way to do that than having Don here in the room. So Don, welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you here. And what I like is how you label yourself. You're in the period which you call life after full-time work, and you don't really use the R word anymore.
That's right. To the extent I use it, I always preface it with happily. So happily retired makes all the difference. Forward looking rather than backward looking.
I think that's a good thing. And also you talk a lot about happiness, and from what I hear from you, I think you're quite a happy person, which is a good thing. But before we dig into that corner of the discussion, in the last webinar, Brinnick van Wyk, he had a question for you. And he started with a framing and said, one important thing for him developing his ideas was his conversation with you, Don. And what he actually pointed out as really helpful was the way how you separated between satisficing and optimizing. So it would be good before we go to the question, if you can explain to us what kind of made him say, aha, that was a good thing. So can you explain it to us?
Sure. I'm delighted that Bernick liked the idea of satisficing. It's a word that was revived by Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in the 1970s. Think of it as a combination of satisfy and suffice. And it means that instead of postponing a solution while you relentlessly seek the best possible one, you start by setting a high standard, you find a solution that meets it, and then you adopt it and move forward. So instead of saying, I will accept nothing short of perfection, you say, pretty good is pretty good, and it's enough. So you're practical rather than perfect.
That's a good starting point. And Brinnick then asked the following question: what are the big rocks, his words, that we need to address as an industry in the framework of satisficing rather than optimizing? And what are the stuff that we could leave for later?
Yeah, so I'll look at this in the context of decumulation. And so what is it that makes a good start, essentially? Well, I think the industry needs to do two things. It needs to take real life into account, and it needs to be reasonably easy to implement. And that's actually a very tough combination, because the average person starting decumulation needs an awful lot of help. But the average person understands close to nothing about the issues that are involved. I mean, accumulation is much easier. You're saving a small proportion of someone's paycheck. So as a first approximation, you can say, oh, everyone's much the same. But decumulation involves replacing the entire paycheck, or at least a big chunk of it. And so you can't say, hey, one size fits all, as if everyone should do the same thing with their replacement paycheck. So I think you need to ask a few questions to make a kind of rough classification across prospective retirees. Of course, I'm thinking of the vast majority of retirees in the middle of the spectrum, not those at the wealthy end who've got enough money that they're not going to have any lifetime spending problems, nor the unfortunate ones at the lower end of the spectrum who really don't have enough to get by at all. So the questions for the vast middle. I think first, just some factual ones. Who are you dealing with? Age, gender, is there a partner? assume they're in average health, because if it's worse than average health, unfortunately, there isn't going to be a lifetime spending problem. I mean, these are tedious factual questions, not difficult. The next set is much tougher, and that's trying to actually say, what is the situation here? So what are your total assets? So the state pension, which is also an asset, your pension pot, other net assets. So that's what you've got. And how much would you like to spend each month, which we can gross up to allow for income tax? I mean, it's going to be much, much, much more difficult to get answers here, because I'm guessing most people have absolutely no clue. So this is going to be really tough. And then maybe one final question, if you wanted to add it, and that is there some minimum amount that you absolutely must have every month and life would be unbearable without it, as opposed to other things where you can adjust your spending? You don't want to have to adjust it, it would hurt. But really, can you distinguish in the jargon between needs and wants, if you want to look at it that way? I think with that information, you could design a default that would allow for potentially, but not necessarily, potentially some guaranteed life income, and come up with a combination of growth and secure investments to generate as much lifetime income as is sort of feasible from the total assets. I mean, but here's my point. The minimum satisficing solution, I think, is that you can't really help unless you have some kind of decumulation default. And I've never seen a decumulation default to this point, because people desperately need that help. It's not just, it's up to you. There needs to be a default. And you actually need potentially more than one path to the default option, depending on the answers to those questions. But once you get the answers to those questions, you can mechanically design 2, 3, 4 paths potentially. Now, customizing a solution is something that financial advisors can do. That goes way beyond satisficing, but that's the satisficing side.
So what you're saying, if you take a UK context to it, there you have a sort of default. When you save, you end up in you have to save for your pension. And then when you retire, they're discussing now if there's a way you can signpost people into a different path. Yeah. But if I would do a satisficing solution, your idea would then be, I take this information based on what I know. I don't really need to sit and ask them all the questions and just come up, say, you're about to retire. Based on what we know about you, here are like 2 or 3 alternatives, pick one, and off you go. And that probably would work for, say, 80-90% of the people. And those who doesn't work for, they need to go and talk to an advisor. But that's probably because they have a lot of money and a very complex situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And have you seen anyone kind of going in this direction, either from a company or kind of a government who facilitated it? Because I got a feeling everybody are a bit afraid. They say, well, you need to take advice or you can provide guidance. But all of a sudden, if you do this, you're a bit afraid that people will litigate you, right? Because if you send them down one of the path and it didn't turn to be fine, people are going to say, how could you do that?
I think you're spot on. I have certainly never come across any examples of this myself. And that could be my limited exposure, but I think you've hit on the real reason. And I think we're afraid to try. And I think the leaders who are afraid to try are the folks in the States, because that's where you get the lawsuits coming out. If something doesn't go absolutely perfectly, and satisficing is short of perfection, but if something doesn't go perfectly, they could get sued. And if you're a sponsor and you're not forced to design a default option for people who are no longer your employees, why take the risk? Yeah, absolutely.
But that's, I think, an important part, because also for the discussions we have in the UK, that people are actually starting to think about it. People need an easier way to make it, and getting it about right is probably better than get it perfectly wrong. That was a hint to Keith Ambassador, by the way, who always liked to use that quote. Yes. Another question here. I was thinking, you've written quite a lot about how you do it yourself. So you do your own self-managed drawdown, and you wrote an article called Your Pension, Your Risk, Your Choice. And when we discussed in the past, I found the thoughts you had behind it quite interesting. So can you tell us a bit more about how do you do it? And now this is your personal approach, right? So
Yeah.
it's a bit homemade and not sort of a product or anything.
Right. This is all homemade. And let me give you the mechanics of it. Basically, we divide our assets, and that's all our assets. We divide them into two, call them buckets, because there's the pension pot, other assets. Let's call them buckets. So we've got two buckets. One bucket holds enough for 5 years of our planned spending, actually the gross income that's required before tax for the spending. And it's invested in very short-term assets. So its value is essentially constant, not fluctuating. And every year we withdraw 1 year's worth, and we hope to replenish it back to 5 years worth of spending from a transfer from the other bucket. And so that second bucket holds everything else, and it's invested to seek growth. And so since basically I'm lazy and cheap, it's essentially in a global equity fund. And we do this because we need growth in order to be able to sustain our lifestyle. But when you seek growth, you also take on risk. The chance that the stocks fall, and we have to make a transfer from that second bucket when it's depleted. So that's why there's 5 years worth of withdrawals in the first bucket. So if stocks fall in the second bucket, we have 5 years to hope for a recovery before we need to make another transfer. So essentially what we think of in that first bucket, we don't think of it as an investment at all. It's our insurance against bad times for the global economy and for the stock markets that depend on the global economy. Meanwhile, if there is a year when this happens, when the market's fallen and we're not going to make a withdrawal, we start to cut our spending so that in a worst case, when there's no recovery even after 5 years, we'll have made 5 cuts and got used to the idea of a lifestyle lower than we're hoping for. I mean, that's the gist of it. The rest of it is all detail.
Thank you, Don. I think that's an interesting idea, because I also use the same when I'm trying to think about how should you allocate, how should you take risk in retirement. It's good to have two mechanisms to think between, rather than having one portfolio where you're trying to come up with a optimal asset mix. It's probably better to do this satisficing approach. Well, how did you come up with this idea? What was sort of the thing that led you there? What was your aha moment behind it?
Oh, I don't know that there was an aha moment. There was a desperation moment, because I didn't really have a choice. I'm a World War II baby, so I'm even older than all these old baby boomers kind of thing. And so there was certainly no help available when I graduated from full-time work. But my career as an actuary and a pension investment consultant helped, because basically that's all I know. So I constructed a thought experiment. I saw pension schemes shutting down, and I thought, well, what if you project these forward, an artificial one, projected forward some years, and imagine that my wife and I are the last two survivors of a defined ambition, target, benefit, whatever name you want to, not a defined benefit, because if there's not enough money, we have to cut our spending kind of thing. So what if we're the last survivors of a scheme of that sort that is still less than 100% funded? What would I advise as a consultant? What would I advise the trustees to do, and the beneficiaries, who actually are the two of us? Well, clearly at less than 100% funded, we still need growth, but we can reduce the short-term risk from seeking growth. The jargon term in the industry is sequence of returns risk. We can reduce that by using, another jargon term, liability-driven investing, meaning that we want to match a few years of desired cash flow with short-term instruments. And the funded ratio, the ratio of what we have to what we'd like to have, is inevitably going to fluctuate in the future. We will do what pension sponsors do. We'll spread the fluctuation, amortize it in the jargon, we'll spread it over the projected remaining life of the scheme. So that's where the idea came from, the thought experiment of the last two survivors of a closing down scheme. The one thing that didn't fit really well was the use of a mortality table, because with only two of us, that's way too uncertain. So what I did was I looked at a mortality table. By the way, I prefer to think of it as a longevity table at this stage of my life. I looked at the table, I adjusted the planning horizon to give us a 75% chance of not outliving it, that sort of thing. And similarly, the size of the insurance bucket, 5 years of cash flow, was to give us the same 75% chance that the market would recover in time. We also looked at the 90% numbers, but as it turned out, when I did the calculations, as to what the annual decumulation amounts would be and how much we could spend, we selected the 75% numbers, which essentially suggested a 5% of the total assets decumulation rate initially. The 90% numbers gave us a 4% initial decumulation rate, and frankly, that was too little for us to spend. Simple as that. So we are taking the higher risk, the 75% position. And as I said, we will spread the impact of the fluctuations gradually.
Yeah, I think the good thing there is if you have time to adjust, you have a planning horizon, therefore it's not so scary if things doesn't go as you didn't hope.
Yeah.
I was wondering, a lot of the people who read your blog, by the way, and if you don't read it, have a look at it, because Don writes a lot about this and been also getting ideas out on how to deal with your thoughts around it if you are interested in this. But I assume that most of your readers have a good savings pot, so they're like in a good spot and can think about it. What would you recommend someone who doesn't have so much pension money? Say you have your state pension and perhaps 3 to 10 years of retirement income and not more. What would your recommendation be to them?
Well, that's a perfect question. And as a matter of fact, I think this approach is actually meant for the modest middle, no matter where the readers are. This is meant for people who don't have enough money that they can be sure to support their desired lifestyle with, let's say, a guaranteed lifetime income. So they are forced to take some risk. And therefore, some trade-off between risk and the insurance safety side is necessary. An academic, my former Russell Investments colleague, Jeff Warren, has explored these ideas even further. And briefly, the kind of thing he's found is something along these lines. These are my words, not Jeff's. So if you divide your desires into needs and wants, then it may make sense to lock in any excess of your needs over the state pension. If the state pension isn't enough, then any excess, it may be a good idea to lock them in via a guaranteed lifetime income. Unfortunately, that goes with the word no one likes, which is annuity. We think of it as a guaranteed lifetime income. And then for the rest of the money above the needs, use some approach along the lines of insurance and investment, that sort of thing. If you want to take a bit more investment risk, set aside less money for certainty. So instead of the guaranteed lifetime income starting now, have a guaranteed lifetime income starting later, maybe at age 85. This is called a deferred annuity. And unfortunately, other than in the States, I don't know where you could buy a deferred annuity. And then you can use the two buckets approach for the rest of it, for the wants. So that would be my recommendation for the modest middle, if you want to think of it that way.
Thank you. I was wondering, when we spoke, you said something that sort of surprised me a bit. I mean, you reveal it yourself that you're a war child, so you're older than the baby boomers. And then I said, so how much do you have in safe and risky assets? You say you have like 70% equities. Does it mean you're like, I don't care about risk, only the upside, or there's something more to this story?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot more to the story. And actually, it's not even 70%, it's 75%. My God, because what we've got is 5 years of 5% withdrawals. That's 25% in the insurance bucket. So the remaining 75% is in stocks. But it's not a reflection of the size of the pot. I mean, there are two reasons why it's so much higher than one traditionally thinks of. One traditionally thinks of the amount in stocks is 100 or 100% minus your age, which would be down in the 30% range kind of thing. So one is that we actually have our equivalent of the state pension, which for the two of us is a big asset. Even though you never place a present value on it, it is a big asset. And that's essentially also an insurance pool. So when you take that into account as an asset, our total growth exposure is much smaller than it actually seems. But the other reason that we are comfortable with it that high is that we have redefined risk. I mean, the traditional academic definition of risk is annual volatility of returns. Well, who cares what number the annual volatility of returns is? The real risk for us is having to withdraw money from a depleted growth bucket. And that's the risk, which if you have 5 years worth, that's a risk that is only a 25% risk and a 75% degree of confidence, at least historically. But that's the background to it. And to me, the really interesting thing about this is my wife's reaction. I mean, she's basically smarter than I am. She just doesn't bother with finance. So she leaves that side to me. Well, when I explained this approach to her, she understood it perfectly, and she sleeps easily at night. And when last year, February, March, the market dropped very steeply, I had a friend who called me in panic and said, "What are you doing? How does this affect you?" And I was able to tell him, "I'm doing nothing. And how does it affect me? Ask me in 5 years. I'll tell you whether it's affected me or not. Because if the market's recovered in 5 years' time, it hasn't affected me at all." So it's a different definition of risk, essentially.
And I think it's interesting that you bring in this approach, because when you look at what most people do when they create a life cycle for your DC investing, they can tend to de-risk quite heavily from age 55 up until 65. And most of them doesn't end up with 75% equity. So it's quite an intriguing approach. And I think what people do, they forget about the state pension, which is a great asset. I did something.
There's the state pension, and also potentially, if you're in reasonable health, a long period ahead. I mean, for us, the joint and loss survivor expected survival period was for a 75% likelihood that we wouldn't make it, was another 26 years. Well, this is a long investment horizon. This is not what happens in the next few years.
So the challenge with investment people, they say life ends at retirement, therefore we need to de-risk. But in reality, that's the start of a very long investment period, hopefully. I did some calculation just for the fun of it. And in the UK, the state pension is £9,340 per year, roughly. And if you would buy that as an inflation-linked annuity in the market, you need a pension pot of £330,000, which is pretty much bigger than what most people already have. So you have actually very good inflation-linked lifelong cash flow in the state pension. So not taking that into account is probably a mistake when you're thinking about your portfolio, but it's easy to do it because it's kind of there and you don't think about it.
Yeah, I'm delighted you put a number on it, because I hadn't put a number on it, and that's a huge number. Thank you. Yeah.
By the way, happiness is another topic which you're kind of known for, and you have written a book called Life 2, and that's about how do you approach retirement. What are the things you should think about? And we're not just talking money here. So Don, can you enlighten us? What kind of recommendation do you give people who are close to retirement? I think some of us in the call doesn't have that far away. Some has quite a long time until it, but it's good to say someone who say have five years left before retirement. What are the things they should think about?
Well, yeah, that Life 2 book is the result of a lot of research, which in turn was prompted by my own experience. I was able to plan my graduation from work, which was absolutely wonderful. And yet I found when it actually happened, I was just totally discombobulated. And I thought, what's going on over here? So I did a lot of research. That's what consultants do. And what my research showed was that there are broadly three big issues that can arise after full-time work stops. I mean, the lucky people don't experience any of them. Others experience one, some experience two, some experience all three, but they're all frightening. And the three kinds of fears are psychological, practical, and financial. I mean, the psychological one is, will I lose my identity? I mean, it's understandable if the workplace defines many of us, particularly if we're successful or enjoy our work. That's who I am. That's what's on my business card. And we spend so much time working and thinking about work that when it stops, for some of us, the identity question arises. Who am I? What would I put on my business card now? The practical fear is, what will I do with my time? I mean, we love a vacation, and extended vacations even better, a sabbatical, fantastic. But an enforced full-time vacation? Thank you. No, that's not what I want. And linked to that is the idea that most of us have a partner, and at least until COVID, we didn't spend all day cooped up in the same small space. So how do my partner and I remain a couple and still be two different people quite happily? So that's the practical one. The financial one is the one that every survey highlights. Will I outlive my money? And for financial geeks like you and me, we tend to focus on that third one. But the thing you find is that you don't just need something to live on. You need something to live for. And I think we need some form of education before retirement. And that's what my Life 2 book is all about, trying to make this truly the happiest time of life.
And you say, I remember when we said, yeah, retirement is one of the happier, stages of your life. And so can you tell a bit more what you learned about happiness when you did your research?
Oh yeah, it is the happiest time of your life, although it has nothing to do with actual retirement. It's age-based. So, I mean, have you ever heard of the U-curve of happiness? How happiness varies by age. It goes like that in a U-curve. And when I last looked, there have been studies in 74 countries, and in all 74, there was a U-curve of happiness. Now, this is an average, and obviously happiness is a subjective thing. Only you can say how happy you are. And of course, happiness depends on so many things: money, the society we live in, whether we're married, children, just a whole bunch of things. But if you isolate how it tends to vary with age, other things being equal, that general U shape always shows up. So happiness is typically high when we're young. It declines as we live our lives, and turns up again in the middle years of life. Eventually, it surpasses even the youth levels. And the average age at which it turns up obviously varies by country, even more individual to individual, but typically it bottoms out at somewhere between 45 and 55. Now, I don't know if you are automatically thinking about where you are on this curve. People tell me when I tell them about this curve, that's the first thing they think of. Where am I on this curve? The simple explanation of the curve is really psychological. I mean, young people, they know nothing, but they seek adventure. And you know what? They're going to make the world a better place, a perfect place. And yet all they really know about life is the fairy tale ending. They lived happily ever after. It's not till they grow up and start living their lives, start a career, get married, raise a family, that they start to get more stressed and dissatisfied with things that don't go quite the way they'd hoped. Of course, many things in their life bring great joy, no question about it. But as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. And it's the little complications we didn't expect, the day-to-day frustrations that reduce our happiness. Then somewhere around the middle of the career, sometimes it's a gradual change, sometimes there's a sort of a cathartic experience, but somewhere around there we stop being perfectionists and we start thinking, wait a minute, things are actually pretty good and that's good enough. Satisficing, remember? Okay, so our measuring stick changes. We look at a glass and instead of saying it's half empty, we say it's half full. course, you know the joke about actuaries and accountants. They look at the same glass and say, that's a glass that's twice as big as it needs to be. Let's change it. But anyway, essentially, we find our happiness in contentment, in experiencing the things that are trusted and true. So now the way to say this is we start to count our blessings. But this has nothing to do with actually retiring. It's just mentally maturing. And the biological reason we do this is that it's the neurotransmitters in our brain. Essentially, we're hardwired to have this happen because the dopamine that drives us towards perfection, got to do this better, this isn't good enough, etc., etc. That dopamine, the flow starts to decline as we age, and it starts to decline particularly strongly after age 40. So that's why we start to acquiesce. We start to say, okay, it's fine. But never mind the brain chemistry behind it. Just think, whatever age you are on that U-curve of happiness, the best is yet to come.
Well, it depends. I mean, for those of us who are like in the 45 and upwards, we sort of, it's getting better. But if you're like 32, you might have a couple of years where your happiness is gonna go down. But at the end of it, it's gonna be better again. But yes, if everybody is sort of getting happier when you're getting older, and retirement probably is going to be where you're happiest in your life, why are people so afraid of retirement then? What you're going into the best part of your life, you're going to be happy, you're going to enjoy it, but a lot of people are afraid of it.
I think that's spot on. And I think for exactly the reason you've mentioned, that this is going to be the best time of life, you should be looking forward to it instead, but you're afraid of it. And I think the reason you're really afraid of it is, I'm scared to think about it because it's a change in life and I'm going to have to reinvent myself. And I think the Life 2 sort of education is useful for that. I mean, we've reinvented ourselves many times in our lives, maybe when we went to university, when we got married, if we moved, when we changed jobs, but probably it's been a long time since we reinvented ourselves, and retirement requires it again. And I think there's actually another reason, and that is, I think the financial industry scares us. I mean, what we hear on the financial side is save more, or you won't have enough to sustain your standard of living, that sort of thing. And Canadian friends of mine, both actuaries, Malcolm Hamilton and Fred Batiste, actually studied this and found that most people live in retirement on far less than they earned when they were working, and yet they're very happy. Why? Well, they've simply adjusted. You know, money isn't everything. You need something to live for as well.
Well, I find this really, really good, because in the industry, we tend to focus so much on the money, and politicians tend to focus on the money. But as you said, you know, that's, and the Beatles song goes, you know, money can't buy me love, but
perfect, yeah.
But it can buy you a dog, so you have a companion. But what do you think we should do then as an industry, apart from stop scaring people, to help them, you know, prepare, to help our customers prepare for retirement in a better way? What would be your suggestions?
I don't know. The thing is, once you've transitioned into retirement, it's no longer unknown. And yes, you can with the money you can buy a dog. It turns out, in fact, that in retirement, the biggest actual problem turns out to be loneliness, because if you've lost your social life, you may have lost touch with your neighbors, relatives, or maybe you didn't like them or whatever. So loneliness actually turns out to be much more prevalent after retirement, and that's very sad. You ask, what can the industry do? I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, ideally, you'd expand the focus of the industry beyond financial products. And you know, if you look at employers, employers now are also focusing on mental health and helping their employees in that way. And that's a win-win situation, because stressed employees are less productive. I mean, I've been researching mental, physical, and financial well-being at 5 stages of life. But it's tough to see the industry incorporating a broader theme when it pays much more to scare people. It's almost like the newspaper industry. All the headlines you see are bad news. Scaring people is what gets them interested in actually in reading it. People don't focus on good news and education and stuff like that, unfortunately. It's human nature.
Yeah, that's a very true comment. And I remember I was at a conference, must have been like 15 years ago or 10 years ago. And there was someone said something that really stuck, and that it was about the UK market. And they had done a survey and said, what are people afraid of? Are you afraid of not having enough money when you're retired? And people went, no, not that much. Are you afraid you're not going to get the health care when you're old? And people were kind of fine with that too. But what really scared them was loneliness, because that's sort of being not part of something, or being sort of being alone is the worst thing you can do to someone. And in the old days, when you banished someone from the community, that was the capital punishment, right? So it is important. Other things than money is really important to take care of.
Yeah, you don't want retirement to be banishment and a death sentence. It really is that bad. Yes, if you're lonely. But your notion of saying, you can get a dog. It's amazing how much that helps.
You can find a hobby with friends.
Yeah.
So let's open the floor, because now we have talked a bit. We covered a lot of ground. I think many of you have a lot of questions you want to ask. I see a lot of comments here of people commenting on the U curve and J curve, and which I think is fun. Russell here says he's 32 and he's looking forward to the other side of the curve. Russell, don't worry, you're going to get there. I remember it too.
Well, I think one of the things Russell can do then at 32 is to say, if I know this is going to happen and I know what's going to cause it is my frustration at things not going perfectly, can I try and overcome that consciously by saying, it's still pretty good. It's when we don't think of trying to overcome it. Danny Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. The thinking fast, the automated bit is, damn it, it's not going right. Thinking slow has to be superimposed on it consciously, saying, that's okay. That's okay. So maybe for you, if you anticipate the fact that it's not going to be perfect, but that's okay, you can start curving up right now.
And perhaps you should think in terms of, let's go for the satisfying solution. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I think it might be a way to achieve much more, even when you want to be achiever, because if you actually do things it's good enough for the purpose, you can do so much more than you're trying to do things that are perfect that doesn't need to be perfect. And particularly if you're going to try to model a future that is unknown, you can spend a lot of time of over modeling things, leading you absolutely nowhere. I see Adrian Balding here has a question. He says, employer sponsors may indeed be too afraid to try default accumulation path for the former employees. But is there any sensible reason why trustees of a master trust should be too afraid to do that? And a bit of context on, in the UK, a master trust is sort of, it's a savings vehicle controlled by trustees, and they look after the members' best interest and not the company. So you have a sort of a method there with sort of people who are in charge who can actually do this. Is that sort of the way forward, you think, Don, in terms of actually solving the payout problem, to jump back to our earlier part of the discussion?
I would love it to be a part of the solution. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what the risks are if you go ahead as a master trust and do that. But I think if you can get into a little bit of dialogue, and this takes time, and more expensive and all that. If you can get into a little dialogue, you may be able to get people into the most appropriate of two or three, or at least given what their choice, given what their desires are, you may be able to direct them. I think one very, very, very important thing is to explain that there is no guarantee and things may not all go to perfection. And I think if we don't overpromise and say, this is the solution, then we may be able to keep a very good system, even though it's not absolutely perfect. I'm thinking as an analogy of the Dutch pension system, which I think is absolutely fantastic. But when the first time came for some to have their pensions cut, this was not what they had been told. They didn't see this as a possibility at all. And so there was a feeling, you've lied to me, I don't trust you, etc., etc. And the thought that a really, really, really good system may change simply because the potential downsides, occasional potential downsides, were not clearly explained in advance, is, I think, a warning sign that tells us if we want to get into default options, we have to explain that they're not perfect and that some of the following things could happen. Is that okay before you sign up?
Yeah, I think this was sort of my old colleague Theo Cocken. He said, overpromise, underdeliver is the worst thing you can do. So, and that I think was what the Dutch did.
Yes.
And we always know the first time something happens, the first cut is the deepest, right? And then next time you realize, yeah, it wasn't that bad, and it actually is working, you get some upside too.
Yeah.
Here we have a question from JCB. He says, I'd be interested in Don's recommendation adjusting the 5-year safety bucket in a future environment of very low interest rates and high inflation. Would he allocate more or less to his growth bucket? So if the world turns out differently than it done in the past, and we seem to be in a period where the world might actually be slightly different, would you do it differently? How would you sort of do this when you're looking ahead?
Oh, he's hit on a very, very, very good point, because essentially what you want from the insurance bucket is a zero real rate of return. And no, you're not going to get it now. And I compromised in my adjustment. What I said was, I want a zero rate of return there, and ideally I'd like a 4% rate of return from my equities. And when would I cash out my equities? As long as my equities are above 2%. I don't want to say equities have to have exactly 4%, at least 4%. It's 3.9. I'm not going to cash it out. It's a failure. But anything above 0 is okay. So I split the difference the way pension trustees often do and say, okay, I'll go for a 2%. A 2% return, but I'm looking for a 2% aggregate return. And since the insurance bucket is going to give me less than the 0% real return that I want, I have to raise the amount. It places a higher burden on the equity bucket. So instead of 2%, it might push it up to 2.5 or thereabouts. So something like that. So that's my very, very rough compromise. And rather than change the 5 years, which I've got very used to, my wife has got very used to, what we're doing is essentially saying we need a bit more of a return before we cash out from the equity bucket.
But one thing what people might ask, no one written it down, so I'm going to ask it anyway, is that, valuations and, timing of markets and stuff like that. Are you looking into that, or is it more like this is more like a rule no matter what?
Oh, I'm looking at it as a rule no matter what. I'm not trying to time markets because I would fail miserably and then I would have huge regret. Essentially what I've done is to say, if you look at it historically, how long do I have to give a fallen market time to recover to a 0 real rate of return? And that turned out to be 5 years. That's historical. Nothing says in the future it's going to be the same way. But one of the nice things that's happened is that as artificially interest rates have been lowered, this is really bad news for savers, but it's good news for investors because it's pushed up the value of discounted future assets. And so what happens is, if 4% is what we hope for, if it goes higher than 4, we will cash out more than 1 year's worth. And so we end up with a larger insurance bucket for the future. So in the same way that my insurance bucket isn't giving me the 0 real that implicitly I wanted from it, my equity bucket is giving me a lot more than the 4% real that I built in there. And so I'm cashing out bigger proportions to do that.
Because you have like a clever rebalancing strategy.
Yeah, ultimately, if I reach, let's say, my age 85 and my wife will still be 39, if we reach that age and we've got enough money to last guaranteed for the rest of our lives because the equity market has done so well, that's fine. I don't need to take risk anymore once we are fully funded. And so the idea of saying, as the equity market goes up, start taking more and more out of it till we reach a fully funded position without equities, that's the goal.
So you're saying you should do what pension trustees should have done is that cash home when you have the money and don't take risk when you don't need to.
Yes, and have a buyout at the end of it if you need to.
We have a question here from Paulina from Chile. And she said, what is your opinion about the insufficiency of the so-called first pillar pension benefits, attempting to improve pension income for the poor, given that in countries with low social security provision, there is not adjustment in expectation to prevent the unhappiness when you're old?
Not my subject. Not my subject. It's more of a political issue. The angle that occurs naturally to me is that anything with the Pillar 1 pension should not borrow from the future. And that's what we tend to do. We're not leaving the world a better place, or at least no worse a place than we inherited. Yeah. So whether one should do it, shouldn't do it, I have some personal opinions. I feel very lucky in my life that I've been born at a time when the skills I have, which are purely intellectual skills, if I were born 1,000 years ago and I was a serf, let me tell you, I do not have the physical strength to have been a very successful serf. I've been born at a time when what I was born with is rewarded. That's very, very, very lucky. For people who are not lucky enough for this, I would like them to get more out of the state pension. But that's a very personal thought, no professionalism in that at all. I just, whatever we do, I just don't want to borrow from our kids and grandkids.
Don, that's a very good comment, because I think when we think about public pension, it's always easy to say, well, let's borrow from the future and hope that growth will solve it for us. And if growth doesn't come, your grandchildren are going to have a problem. And I think this is the major public policy issue going forward, particularly if we're going to see a period with lower growth. You're also going to say, Don, you were probably lucky to be born in a period which seen massive growth in population and economic situation. So, you know, people born 100 years earlier than you and perhaps born today might not experience that sort of run. On the other hand, they might, you never know. So probably better to be prepared. Emma Matthews have a question. When graduating from work sets you in a new, very long time horizon, are pension schemes de-risking too much for members? Could they be hurting their post-graduation lifestyle during the de-risking phase instead of helping? ?
So distinguish between DC and other kinds, because other kinds, someone else is giving you a guarantee. Now, how successful they are at fulfilling it. So this is DC?
Yeah.
Yes, I think they are by and large de-risking far too fast. And I don't know where they're getting those numbers from. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons. There's the whole to versus through retirement. Should we plan to retirement or should we plan through? Well, my life extends through retirement. Everybody's life extends through retirement, not to. The only reason you stop at to retirement is because you want to be rid of that and say, I don't want to be, as the sponsor, I don't want to be involved with that anymore. But really, lifetime planning, for most of us, if we are healthy, we're looking at a long period. When I was 70, I looked at, my wife was somewhat younger. I looked at our projected survival age, and the 50-50 was, I think it was 26 years. And then it went to 31 years for the 75, or was it 21, 26, 35? I can't remember, but it was 20 to 30 years essentially. And this is a long period for a couple if they're in average health. I wasn't looking at, exceptionally good health. I just plugged in average health for both of us. And I think given how much of a lifetime is still ahead, the idea of saying, well, we want most of our money out of growth, even though we don't have enough to fulfill all our wants is unnecessary. So I would love to see the glide path reassessed.
And Emma has another question, which I think is a follow-up on it, is that how else should large pension scheme help members during the savings phase? And should more customization be offered by pension schemes before getting into the realm of individual customized financial advice? So more or less, instead of just having one default, should you actually try to customize it based on what you know about the member and then say, we think this is a good thing for you?
I don't know how much sponsors and schemes would do, but the way I looked at saving for retirement was in the financial side of the whole thing, was in phases that I called very roughly: get started, get serious, get set. And get started is just get the money in, make it automated, that you don't have to think, get into a glide path, etc., etc. The get serious phase is probably 20, 25 years before your planned retirement. And that's when your earnings tend to be peaking. I mean, your expenses are too, in a sense, because you've got family and so on. But that's when your earnings are peaking. And there's still enough time to be able to make adjustments and have them useful, because in the early days, you've got relatively little money that you're working with. But this is when you can start getting into much higher contributions, a customized glide path and stuff like that. So I think from about 20 years before retirement, that's when you get serious and start to think about customization. How much the individual has to do, how much the sponsor should do, master trust, I have no idea where you divide the responsibility, but I think from about 20 years before retirement, it's time to start getting serious. If not now, you will never get serious.
I think that's a good recommendation, Don. And I think we know that most people are relatively unengaged in the pension because you're saving for it, but you have probably 100 more things that you consider important. Mm-hmm. So it comes down on the priority list. So I have this feeling that more customization from the industry would probably be a good thing. And if you really want to do it yourself, of course, you should be able to customize it so it fits really your purpose. So satisficing is probably a good lead word here as well. Mm-hmm. We have a question from Manuel. He says, you both mentioned trust, the trust issue at the same point in the conversation. First, we're talking about trust in the pension system, pension funds, or both. Second, recognizing that trust is an issue, what can be done to start recovering that trust?
Well, I remember something Stephen Covey wrote. He said, trust is like a bank account. You accumulate it in small amounts and so on. But the first time you lose that trust, sometimes it's like the entire bank account has been gone and all the trust you've built up laboriously has gone, and the bank may not be willing to take future deposits from you. So trust is a very, very emotional thing. And I think all we can do to build it up again is start slowly, and don't expect people to respond when you say, well, I'm terribly sorry about that, let's start again. Yes, well, it takes a long time to forgive. And so it's something very slow, and we can only build it up slowly. I don't know what else we can do. But I think, as you mentioned, Theo saying, don't overpromise and underdeliver. I think we have to be very careful that we actually educate along the way. And that's yet another tangential topic. Education. Financial literacy is low everywhere in the world. People are not terribly interested in becoming financially literate. It's too difficult, etc., etc., etc. So we have a very tough job educating people financially, and yet I don't know what else one can do. So it's very tough. I don't have a magic wand.
I have a comment on that because I did some work up in Sweden and we looked into this, and there was a survey made, and the conclusion was that Swedes are actually quite financially literate. Then you ask them, so what do you do? By the way, so they knew what to do. They knew that costs were important. They knew sort of on the top of the list that you should look at cost, you should look at return, you should look at risk, etc. At the bottom, they said, the name of the provider or the mutual fund is, that's at the bottom of the ranking. And then you ask them, so what do you do in your own savings? And what they kind of remembered was the name of the provider. So even if you know what to do, doesn't mean you actually do it. And I think that is even a bigger problem than financial literacy, is actually how do you take it from thought to action?
Yeah, good point. Very good. Yes, I didn't realize that.
I think we're running towards the end of our conversation. And in the same way, Brynnick, we're allowed to ask you a question. So now you answered all the questions from us, from me, from the audience. And now you have the chance to ask the next speaker a question. And the next speaker is Zvi Bodhi from Boston University.
Oh, fantastic.
And I know you read a lot about his stuff and have thoughts around it. So what question would you like to ask Zvi?
Well, I think Zvi is fantastic. He writes wonderfully, and speaking of education, his writing educates beautifully. I really don't have anything to ask him on the content of what he writes. What I have wondered about occasionally reading his writing is the context of his writing, and I'm thinking of not just academic writing, but popular writing. He wrote a book called Risk Less and Prosper. What a lovely title, Your Guide to Safer Investing. And that sort of sums up my question. You've seen that for myself. I was very pleasantly surprised to find that my non-state pension assets could be 75% focused on long-term growth. Zvi focuses on the safe side of things. I don't know, maybe he thinks that people in general are encouraged to take more risk than they can bear. I don't know, but I would love to understand the context of his focus on safety, because as I say, the content of what he writes is just beautiful.
Thank you very much. And with that, I will relay that question to Zvi. And I would like to thank you, Don, for sharing your wisdom with us. And it's been really, really good. We get a lot of applause coming from the chat as well. And I would say it was very enlightening. And it's very good talking to you, because you put the finger on what's matter. And the good news for everybody, when you get older, it's going to get better, at least if you're 40 years or more. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Don, for being here. And hope to see you next time in Pioneering Pensions.
My pleasure. I will be in the audience next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.